The Underground Railroad, Mexico route.
The Underground Railroad Mexican route helped the movement to abolish slavery by broadening the scope of opposition, by challenging the slave laws in the United States, and by offering enslaved people a path to freedom.
Before diving into the main story, let's explore some background information that shapes it. To get a better understanding of the political impact the Mexican Underground Railroad routes had during slavery, we turn to Richard Blackett's journal article. In this journal article, Richard Blackett explores how the journeys of enslaved individuals, particularly those who escaped through the Underground Railroad, helped shape the abolitionist movement. The escapes through the southern routes weren't mere acts of rebellion. These courses of events ultimately shaped abolitionist politics. Blackett highlights case studies of enslaved people who were able to escape from the means of these railroads and the political consequences that derived from fleeing during the abolitionist movement, such as provoking backlash, which led to increased pressure on slaveholders to enforce stricter fugitive slave laws. Blackett acknowledges that some abolitionists traveled south to encourage escape, including toward Mexico, resulting in the expansion of the traditional geography of the Underground Railroad. Mexico is acknowledged as one of various destinations for slaves seeking freedom in Blackett's article. He lists Mexico as a prime example in his quote, "Those who sought their freedom in the North, Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, or the Indian nations." The Mexican Underground Railroad route also helped the movement to abolish slavery by broadening the scope of opposition. Because, apart from offering slaves a chance at freedom, it also challenged the slave laws in the United States. Some of these slave laws included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which gave local governments and citizens the authority to capture and return accused runaways, penalizing those who helped them escape. Or the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, acting as a response to the ineffectiveness of the 1793 law. Southern slave owners pushed for more aggressive legislation. Property laws regarding enslaved people were also opposed, because from the perspective of Southern slave owners, escaping to Mexico was theft of private property. But how did the Mexican route change these laws? Well, by crossing into Mexico, enslaved people escaped U.S. jurisdiction, nullifying slaveholder claims and gaining protection beyond American law. Some groups even formed militias to guard against American slave catchers. Richard's journal article reinforces these impacts by explaining that the Southern escapes, including the route to Mexico, was not insignificant, and the Underground Railroad routes in Mexico helped fuel the abolition to slavery. Although Blackett doesn't specifically mention the Mexican Underground routes to a great extent, he still believes the impact was significant despite the marginal escapes to Mexico. But newer estimates now say that between 5,000 to 10,000 enslaved people fled south, meaning there was nothing marginal about the escapes through the routes to Mexico. On page 284 of his article, he notes, "But the numbers belie the impact of their actions, indicating that even the small-scale resistance of slaves had played a pivotal role in the lead-up to the Civil War."
This is Alice Baumgartner, an associate professor of history at the University of Southern California. She wrote a book concerning the Mexico route of the Underground Railroad called South to Freedom. In her book, she reveals how the abolition of slavery in Mexico transformed the political landscape of North America. When Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829, it became a safe haven for fugitives and destabilized the American South. Those who supported the annexation of Texas and the invasion of Mexico in the 1840s believed that these actions would curb slave escapes and safeguard the institution of slavery. Instead, the seizures of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico undermined those ambitions and destabilized the balance between free and slave states.
Some historians downplayed the Mexican route of the Underground Railroad, while others argued that it was less organized, harder to trace, and less documented, and focused more on the northern escapes. However, Bramgart and Blackett both show that even unstructured resistance had political effect that contributed to the abolition of slavery. A worthy person that is worth mentioning is Nathaniel Jackson. Even though he kinda ugly looking though, he gets a golden star for being a decent human being and for helping others in need. A man that helped many from the South escape to Mexico, who lived near between the border of Texas and Mexico with his wife, Matilda Hicks, who he helped free. They offered a safe haven and a ferry ride across the Rio Grande into Mexico. They were driven by their religion and anti-slavery beliefs. It is said that they will help anyone in need.
The thousands of enslaved people who escaped through the Mexican routes of the Underground Railroad were granted freedom and protection under Mexico's anti-slavery laws. Once across the border, many were able to rebuild their lives and live without fear of being returned to bondage. These escapes, however, did more than change individual lives. They also strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Mexico, and deepened the sectional tensions that eventually led to the American Civil War. As we've discussed throughout our presentation, the Underground Railroad was not only a northern movement, but a continental struggle for freedom. The routes to Mexico showed that the fight against slavery reached beyond U.S. borders, and that enslaved people were willing to risk anything for liberty, no matter which direction they had to take. When Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, it became a beacon of hope for countless enslaved people in Texas and Louisiana. For many, it was not only geographically closer, but also symbolically powerful, a nation that recognized their humanity and legal rights to freedom. These routes were less organized and the well-known northern pathways, but their impact was just as revolutionary. Every crossing into Mexico directly challenged U.S. slave laws, defied the Fugitive Acts, and exposed the hypocrisy of a country that called itself free while sustaining slavery. Historians like Richard Blackett and Alice Bogg-Marder remind us that even though fewer people escaped south, their actions carried enormous political weight. The very existence of a free Mexico put pressure on the United States, forcing it to confront the growing moral and political divide over slavery, one that would ultimately erupt into civil war. In the end, the Underground Railroad to Mexico teaches us that freedom knows no borders. It was a movement divided by courage, resistance, and unity across nations. It reshaped the political landscape of North America and paved the way toward the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865. So often, we celebrate history and never learn to